Welcome to Sleepy Hollow Uncovered, the channel where we dig deeper into the stories that haunt our history. Have you ever wondered about the stories hidden within forgotten cemeteries? We often think of them as quiet, peaceful places, the final, silent chapter in a life story. But some cemeteries don't whisper of peace. They scream with the echoes of lives cut short, of stories deliberately erased, and of secrets so dark they stain the very soil they're buried in. Today we journey to a place far beyond the legend of the Headless Horseman, to a small, decaying New England town called Haven's Rest. It is home to Whisperwood, a long-abandoned cemetery where the dead are not at rest. What begins as a historian's simple project to document a forgotten place becomes a terrifying descent into a town's hidden sin. We will uncover a section of the cemetery where the dead have no names, and a strange recurring symbol that hints at a supernatural covenant made with the land itself. Join us as we resurrect the lost stories of the forgotten, and discover why, in some places, the most terrifying ghost is the truth. This is Whisperwood, an elegy for the forgotten. The dead, in my professional experience, were reliably quiet. They were data points, names on a census record, signatures on a deed. They were the silent architects and inhabitants of the buildings I studied. Their lives a collection of footnotes to the grand, solid facts of brick and mortar, of stress loads and architectural theory. For 2 decades, Elias Vance, professor of historical architecture, had built a career on the tangible. I believed in what I could measure, what I could touch, what I could verify in a climate-controlled archive. Ghosts, I was fond of saying at academic cocktail parties, were simply a failure of insulation and an overabundance of imagination. My magnum opus, the project that was to be the capstone of my career, was a book tentatively titled The Architecture of Incarceration. It was to be a comprehensive study of the American penitentiary from the Quaker-inspired radial designs of the early 19th century to the brutalist, supermax fortresses of the modern age. I saw these places not as haunted houses, but as profound, and often brutal statements of societal philosophy, rendered in stone and steel. They were machines for living, designed to contain, to punish, and in their most idealistic forms, to reflect. My interest was in the blueprints, the theories, the cold, hard sociology of confinement. I was, I admit, a man who had built a fortress of rationality around himself. The world beyond the provable, the spiritual, the supernatural, I had no time for it. My wife Anna had been a believer. She saw meaning in coincidences, felt energy in old places, and spoke of a world beyond our own with a gentle, unwavering faith. And then one rainy Tuesday, a drunk driver with a suspended license ran a red light, and her world and mine ceased to exist. In the deafening silence that followed, I found no comfort in faith, no solace in the idea of a spirit moving on. I found only the brutal, tangible facts of a police report, of a death certificate. I found comfort only in the cold, hard logic of a world without ghosts. So, when my research itinerary led me to the gates of the now decommissioned Blackwood Penitentiary in West Virginia, I came armed with a digital camera, a laser measure, and a deeply ingrained skepticism. I was there to study its famous panopticon-inspired rotunda, a marvel of 19th century correctional design. I was not there to hunt for ghosts. The fact that Blackwood was consistently ranked among the most haunted prisons in America was to me a tiresome but predictable piece of local folklore, a marketing gimmick for the historical society that now ran the place. The warden of the historical society, a portly, enthusiastic man named George, was more than happy to regale me with the prison's haunted history as he led me through the main gates. "They say you can still hear the chains dragging in the old infirmary," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "And in the solitary wing, they call it, the hole, men have been known to come out screaming about a shadowy man with no face." "Of course, you're a man of science, Doctor. You probably don't believe in any of that." "I believe," I said, my voice echoing in the cavernous entrance hall, that old buildings settle. I believe in drafts, in acoustics, and in the power of suggestion." George chuckled. "Well, you spend a night in cell block D, and we'll see if you still believe that." He was joking, of course, but as he led me toward the rotunda, the heart of the great decaying beast, I felt the first subtle prickle of unease. The air inside Blackwood was heavy, oppressive, and unnaturally cold, a damp chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone. It was the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the cold of accumulated misery, a psychic residue left behind by a century of despair. I dismissed the feeling, of course, a failure of insulation, nothing more. Blackwood Penitentiary was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The central rotunda, a vast circular space with a domed ceiling, was ringed with tiers of cells. A single guard, stationed in the central tower, could in theory observe every inmate without them knowing if they were being watched. It was a design of chilling, omniscient efficiency, intended to create a state of constant, paranoid self-regulation. I spent the day in a state of academic bliss, measuring walls, photographing architectural details, and losing myself in the elegant, brutal logic of the blueprints. I worked my way through the cell blocks, from A to C, the feeling of unease slowly fading, replaced by the familiar comfort of my work. And then I entered cell block D. It was the oldest and most decayed part of the prison, the place where the most violent and incorrigible offenders had been housed. The air here was different. The ambient, low hum of the building's utilities seemed to die away, leaving a profound, listening silence, and the cold here was a physical presence. It was a sharp, biting chill that sank into my bones, making the hairs on my arm stand on end. I checked the thermostat on my wrist, 65 degrees. Same as the rest of the prison. A draft, I told myself. A simple anomaly of airflow in a decaying structure. I continued my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was a classic symptom of infrasound. I rationalized. Low-frequency sound waves known to cause feelings of anxiety and dread. Old buildings were full of them. I stopped before a particular cell. The number was almost comforting in its cliché. The door was a solid plate of steel, with a small Judas hatch window. According to the records, this had been a long-term isolation cell, a place of ultimate punishment. As I raised my camera to photograph the lock mechanism, I felt it, a distinct, unmistakable feeling of being watched. I lowered the camera and looked around. I was completely alone. The cell block stretched out before me, a long, silent corridor of rusted steel and peeling paint. Yet the feeling persisted, an intense, focused scrutiny that seemed to be emanating from the darkness inside cell D. I fought the urge to flee. I was a man of science. I would not be spooked by a draft and a cliché. I forced myself to walk to the cell door and peer through the small, grimy window. The cell was a 6 by 9 foot concrete box, empty save for a rusted iron bed frame. For a long moment, I saw nothing but shadows, and then I heard it. A sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. A soft, single, rhythmic thump. It was the sound of a footstep, a single, soft, barefooted step on a concrete floor. I recoiled from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty cell block. Nothing. The sound was gone. My research methodology was twofold: architectural analysis and oral history. I believed that to truly understand a building, you had to speak to the people who had lived and worked within its walls. The Historical Society had provided me with a list of contacts, mostly former administrators and guards. At the top of the list was a name with a single, handwritten note beside it. Evelyn Reed, guard, 1975-2005. She knows where all the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking. I met Evelyn Evie Reed in a small roadside diner that smelled of stale coffee and bacon grease. She was a woman in her late 60s with a tough, leathery face, a cloud of silver-white hair, and eyes the color of faded denim. She had a grip like a vice, and a gaze that was direct and unflinching. She was not a woman who suffered fools gladly. "So," she said, after we'd ordered, "you're the fancy professor writing a book about the architecture of Blackwood. You gonna write about the lead paint and the asbestos, or just the pretty art?" I smiled. "I'm interested in the human experience of the design, Miss Reed. How the structure affected the men who lived and worked there." "Call me Evie," she said, taking a long sip of her coffee. "And if you want to know about the human experience, you have to look past the blueprints. That place is alive, Doctor. It breathes. And it remembers." Here we go, I thought. The folklore. Warden George mentioned the prison has a reputation for being haunted. Evie's gaze hardened. "It's not a reputation. It's a fact. I worked C Block for 30 years. I saw men go mad in that place. I saw things that didn't have a rational explanation. I decided to test the waters. I was in cell block D today. It has a peculiar atmosphere. A flicker of something recognition, and a deep old fear passed through her eyes. "Ah," she said softly. "So you've met our other long-term resident. I'm not sure what you mean." "The silent inmate," she said, her voice dropping. "That's what we used to call him. The old-timers had other names for him. The Echo Man. The one who was forgotten. He's the real warden of D Block." This was it, the heart of the folklore. "So he's a ghost?" "He's a presence," she corrected, her gaze intense. "You don't see him. Not really. You feel him. A cold that makes your teeth ache. The feeling of eyes on the back of your neck. And sometimes you hear him. A single footstep, like a man pacing in his cell, waiting for a release that never comes." My blood ran cold. It was the exact sound I had heard. I tried to keep my expression neutral, my skepticism intact. "It's a compelling story, Evie. Every old prison has one. This one's different," she said, leaning forward, "because this one is tied to something real. A story that the administration buried a long, long time ago. A story about an inmate who didn't die, didn't escape, didn't get paroled. He just vanished. Right out of cell D13. "Vanished?" I said, the word sounding absurd. "That's impossible. There would be a record and an investigation." Evie smiled. A sad, bitter expression. "You're a historian, Doctor. You should know better than anyone that a record can be changed. It can be lost. It can be burned. They say his file just disappeared. One day he was on the rolls, the next he wasn't. The official story was a clerical error, but the men who worked that block, they knew someone had been erased. And whatever he was, whatever he did, he left a part of himself behind in that cell, an echo, and it's been pacing in there ever since." I left the diner with my head spinning. It was a classic prison legend, a ghost story born of fear and claustrophobia. And yet, the details she had described, the cold, the feeling of being watched, the single footstep, they matched my own experience with a chilling precision. I was still a skeptic, but I was a skeptic with a growing, gnawing sense of doubt. I had to know more. I had to see the records for myself. The Blackwood archives were a historian's nightmare. Housed in a damp, poorly lit basement room, they were a chaotic jumble of water-stained boxes and rusting file cabinets. The Historical Society was doing its best, but they were underfunded and overwhelmed. It took me a full day of digging through dusty, mouldering files just to find the inmate records from the period Evie had mentioned. The late 90s. I was looking for a ghost, a name that had been erased, but how do you find evidence of an absence? I started by cross-referencing the daily census logs with the transfer and release records. It was a tedious, mind-numbing process. After hours of work, my eyes gritty with dust and fatigue, I found it, a discrepancy. In the census log for cell block D, dated November 12, 1948, was a name Crane, Jacob, inmate Jan 818. But in the log for the very next day, November 13th, his name was gone. Cell D13 was listed as empty. I felt a jolt of adrenaline. I immediately went to the transfer and release ledgers for that date. Nothing. No record of a Jacob Crane being moved, paroled, or dying. I went to the main inmate file cabinets and looked for his file. 817 was there. 8119 was there. The slot for 8118 was empty. A blank space where a life should have been. Evie was right. A man had been erased. It was not proof of a ghost, of course. It was proof of a cover-up, of a profound and disturbing bureaucratic anomaly. But it was a tangible link to the story she had told. I went back to the daily guard logs for D-Block from that week, searching for any mention of an incident. The logs were filled with the mundane details of prison life, meal times, yard rotations, minor altercations, but as I scanned the pages, I began to notice something else. In the margins of the entries, written by different guards over several days, was a recurring doodle, a small, simple, hand-drawn spiral, like a coiled snake or a small whirlpool. It meant nothing, of course. It was a meaningless scribble, the product of a bored mind on a long, quiet night shift. But as I looked at the spiral, a strange feeling of unease settled over me. There was something about its shape, something hypnotic and unsettling, that resonated with the cold I had felt in that cell block. I photographed the logbook, the empty file slot, the census record. I had the facts. I had the evidence of a deep, historical wrong. And I had a story that was becoming far more complex and far more terrifying than a simple study of architecture. My academic curiosity was rapidly transforming into a dark, all-consuming obsession. I had to know what had happened to Jacob Crane. My next destination was the one prison whose name is a legend in itself, Alcatraz, the Rock. I flew to San Francisco, my mind still preoccupied with the mystery of Jacob Crane and the unsettling silence of Blackwood. My academic purpose on the island was to study its unique relationship with its environment, a maximum security facility placed in the middle of a bustling city, its isolation both psychological and physical. As the ferry cut through the choppy grey waters of the bay, the prison loomed out of the mist, a grim concrete monolith that seemed to defy the natural beauty surrounding it. The island was smaller than I had imagined, a windswept, lonely rock that felt a world away from the vibrant city just over a mile across the water. The atmosphere inside was different from Blackwood. Alcatraz was a tourist attraction now, its cell blocks filled with the shuffling feet and multilingual chatter of 1,000 visitors. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and popcorn. It was hard to feel the weight of its history through the din of the present. I spent the day doing my work, documenting the architecture, the rust-pocked cell doors, the ingenious design of the dining hall, which was equipped with tear gas canisters in the ceiling in case of a riot. But as the day wore on and the crowds began to thin, the island's true nature began to emerge, a profound sense of isolation and I made my way to D-Block, the prison's solitary confinement wing, the infamous hole, and as I stepped through the doorway, the familiar, unnatural cold hit me like a physical blow. The sounds of the tourists faded away, replaced by the same listening, oppressive silence I had felt at Blackwood. It was here, the same presence, the same chill that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the bay. I walked the narrow corridor, peering into the empty, soundproofed cells. This was where the most broken men had been sent, a place designed to strip away the last vestiges of a person's sanity. I thought of Jacob Crane. Had a man like him, a man erased from the system, existed here too? It seemed impossible. Alcatraz was a federal prison, a high-profile institution. A man couldn't just vanish from the rock. Could he? That evening, I took the night tour. As darkness fell over the island, the atmosphere transformed. The last of the tourists departed, leaving only a small group of us, with a park ranger, a woman with a historian's passion for her subject. The prison, now empty and silent, felt like a tomb. She led us through the cell blocks, her voice a low, respectful murmur, telling stories of the famous inmates, Al Capone, the Birdman, Machine Gun Kelly. But it was in D Block that her stories took a different turn. The guards who worked here, she said, her flashlight beam cutting through the inky blackness. They had stories that didn't make it into the official reports. They said this place was different, that the despair was so thick you could taste it, and they talked about a cell at the very end, this one. She shone her light on the last cell on the right. It was identical to the others, a blank concrete box. They never kept anyone in here for long, she continued. Not after the first few years. Inmates would complain of a constant, unbearable cold. Some claimed they weren't alone in the cell. They spoke of a whisper that was not a whisper, a presence that had no form. And one night, in 1938, an inmate in this cell began to scream. He screamed for hours that something with glowing eyes was in the cell with him. The guards ignored him. In the morning, when they opened the door, the inmate was dead. He had been strangled, but the door was locked from the outside. He was alone. A nervous shudder went through our small group. And there's another story, the ranger said, her voice dropping even lower. A story the old-timers swore was true, about an inmate, sometime in the 50s. A quiet man, a nobody. He was put in D Block for some minor infraction, and one morning, during the count, his cell was empty. The door was still locked. He was just gone. They searched the entire island, never found a trace. The official report says he found a way to squeeze through the bars and drowned, trying to swim to shore. But the guards, they called him the Echo, because for years after he disappeared, some of them claimed that if you stood here, late at night, when everything was quiet, you could hear a single, soft footstep inside his empty cell. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in my hotel room, the lights of San Francisco glittering outside my window, but my mind was a million miles away, trapped on that cold, dark rock in the middle of the bay. I was no longer a skeptic. A skeptic looks for evidence to debunk a theory. I was now a man with a terrifying theory that was being supported by evidence I couldn't explain. I had to go back. The next morning, I took the first ferry to the island. I told the park staff I had left a piece of equipment behind, a lie that got me access before the first wave of tourists arrived. I went straight to D Block, to the last cell on the right, the cell of the Echo. The cell was empty, sterile. I ran my hands over the cold concrete walls, searching for something, anything. And then I found, in the back corner of the cell, near the floor, almost completely obscured by the shadows, was a small, faint scratch mark. It took me a moment to recognize the shape, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. It was a spiral, a small, perfectly formed spiral, identical to the ones I had seen in the guard's logbook at Blackwood Penitentiary, 3,000 miles away. It had been scratched into the hard concrete with a piece of stone or metal, a secret signature left behind by a man on the verge of being erased. I stared at it, a wave of cold, terrifying understanding washing over me. This was not folklore. This was not a coincidence. This was a trail, a series of breadcrumbs left behind in the darkest, most forgotten corners of America's prison system. My book, The Architecture of Incarceration, was dead. A new, far more dangerous project had just been born. I was no longer studying the history of buildings. I was hunting the ghost of a man named Jacob Crane, or perhaps the ghost of an idea he represented. I took out my phone and called the one person who I knew would not dismiss my story as a failure of insulation and an overabundance of imagination. "Evie," I said, when she answered. "It's Elias Vance. I need your help. I think I found another one." My journey into the haunted history of American prisons had truly begun, and I had a terrible, sinking feeling that the deeper I dug, the more I would find, and that the truth at the bottom of it all was a truth that the system, and perhaps the world, was not ready for me to uncover. The echo was getting louder, and I was afraid of what it was trying to say.